Where is God in the midst of suffering? How can there be one truth amongst so many different beliefs, people, and religions? How are science and faith compatible with one another? These are things that not just skeptics wrestle with, but we all struggle to try to figure out what it is that we believe. I've got questions. You've got questions. We're going to go on this journey not alone, but with some of the great thinkers of our time, and we're going to try to learn from them and from one another the great mystery that is our faith.
On today's big question of faith, we're exploring a question that came from me in 9th grade in Mrs. Flowers' biology class. She was teaching about Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, and aftermath of what she taught began to draw lines of demarcation between two very different groups of people. On the one side of the class were those who were standing up for their faith. On the other half were those who said that they were standing on the firm grounds of science. And so as the weeks drew on, we began to argue and to debate. And we began to try to say that you can't have one with the other, that it was either or. And the question before us today is, are science and faith compatible with one another? Is there any way for these two things to live together? Do they have anything to offer to one another? And do we need each of these different disciplines to help us to understand the fullness of life?
One of the unique vantage points that you have is that you have both a doctorate in the sciences as well as theology. But a lot of people argue today that faith and science are incompatible with one another. When people come to you with questions about the science and the faith and that you can't believe in both, how do you respond to that?
Well, it's certainly true that a lot of people think they argue that science and religion are incompatible. In fact, they're simply asserting this. I mean, let me give you a very simple example. I have a very good friend who is a scientist and is also a socialist. But you cannot prove political values scientifically, so his socialism is incompatible with his science. So are we saying that scientists can have no moral beliefs, no political beliefs, because these are derived by different methods? Of course not. The reality of being human is we use different methods for different areas. This method for science, this method for politics, this method for ethics, and this method for faith. And to be a human being as a whole, you need all of these things. You need to be able to bring all of these together to give you this bigger vision of reality. So there are those who say, only science. No, that's simply someone who deliberately shuts out a vast area of life. Science and faith give us a stereoscopic vision of life. We need them both to deal with the depth we experience in this world.
Science answers different questions to faith. Science answers the question, when and how. Faith answers the question, who and why. And science can never answer the questions who and why. It can only answer the how and when question. We need both science and faith. And the two are not in conflict. If they were, there wouldn't be all these scientists who are Christians and believers. And there are, as you know, there are thousands and thousands of scientists, including someone like Francis Collins, who was perhaps one of the greatest scientists in the world today, the leader of the 3,000 scientists unraveling the human genome. He led that team. And yet he can say, I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, I believe in Jesus. His science has not caused him to disbelieve. Rather, it was his belief in the importance of science that made him investigate the truth of Christianity and come to the conclusion, it's true.
modern science started basically as a Christian activity. If you go back to the time of the Renaissance, etc., an awful lot of the great early scientists in the early modern period were devout Christians who thought they were thinking God's thoughts after him, exploring the world to see what it was that God had done and how he'd done it. And even in the 19th century, when Darwin was doing evolution and so on, a lot of devout Christian theologians like B.B. Warfield, a great conservative here in America, said, well, if that's how God made the world, that's how God made the world, not a big deal. The idea that science and faith are at loggerheads with one another, it's funny, there's a book recently come out in Britain by an atheist philosopher called John Gray, who it's called 7 Types of Atheism. And the number 1 type, which he mentions, he says in order to dismiss it, is this trivial, boring 19th century idea that science and faith are opposed to each other. He says, so we just name that in order to dump it. Now let's get on to the really interesting things. And when I read that, I thought, I'm really glad to hear you say that, because there's an awful lot of people who still think this is where the world is.
There is a way of looking at this which enables us to hold these two sides of a very important conversation together. And the real danger, I think, is that we say because this is right, that cannot be right. But what if each of these perspectives come together to give us a deeper and richer understanding, so we don't have to surrender the idea that God created this wonderful universe or that science helps us to make sense of it, but somehow these are different ways of approaching it which enrich each other and give us this deeper vision. We are so used to dichotomous thinking, this or that, but not both. What I'm saying is we need to weave these threads together to give us this deeper and richer way of looking at things.
I'm an expert on almost nothing, certainly not on science and faith, but I do know a lot of experts. And one of the experts I know is a guy called Hans Halvorsen, who's a professor of philosophy and math at Princeton, and probably one of the top 4 philosophers of science in the world today. And he's also a serious Christian himself, though I think he would say that that's not irrelevant to his views, but I'm just sort of mentioning that incidentally. And he says not only is it the case that historically the first people to frame what we now talk about as science, the sort of modern scientific method, were Christians, but that they actually developed science because of their Christian belief, not in spite of it.
Yeah.
So the things that flowed into that were, one, the idea that the universe was made by a rational, consistent, law-giving God. And so they thought, if the God described in the Bible did make the universe, as the Bible claims, then maybe he made it according to rational, consistent principles that people made in his image, as the Bible also claims, might be able to discern. But they also reasoned that because the God described in the Bible is completely free, that he could have created the universe any way he liked. And so the only way to figure out how he in fact did create the universe is to go and look. What's interesting, if you look historically, is that every single supposedly sort of science versus Christianity debate that you see, whether it's starting with Galileo right through to Darwin, the Big Bang, etc., there are always Christians on both sides.
Right.
And the reality is Christians have been arguing about how the scriptures relate to science since at least the 4th century. I mean, St. Augustine of Hippo had some things to say about that. So we first need to dispel this idea that it's science over here, Christians over there. And I mean, Galileo is a great example. Like, Galileo was not the atheist hero fighting against the church. He's actually a Christian himself. And he was saying, do you know what? We've been interpreting the creation stories in the Bible in non-literal ways for hundreds of years. Why is it suddenly that we're saying, no, this can't be the case?
I've been fortunate to work with people like the Biologos Foundation, where there are some wonderful Christians who are top-flight scientists, obviously people like Francis Collins, who's well known around the world for his work on DNA and so on, but also astronomers and physicists. And I knew Sir John Polkinghorne, one of the greatest physicists in Britain in the last generation, a fine Christian theologian and priest. And so I have never seen any need to accept that polarization. And I often tell my dear American friends that actually This is a localized American fight, which goes back to the Scopes trial and to the old fundamentalist modernist controversy, which actually in some ways is replaying bits of your Civil War. And that actually is not how the rest of the world sees it.
I think when it comes to evolution, which is probably the sort of 20-ton gorilla, I don't know how fat gorillas are meant to be, the large chimpanzee, to use an apt comparison in the kind of science and faith debate. I think serious followers of Jesus who are very serious readers of the Bible can come to different conclusions. But I think there are some simplistic moves that people make on the side of thinking that they're defending the scriptures kind of against evolution that to me theologically are not compelling. And the reason for that is that, folks might say, well, evolution kind of presupposes that God created a world and planned to create through all sorts of messy things like death and sex and violence and like all sorts of distasteful things. And that it was really kind of a messy process over a very long period of time. And we like to think in our minds that God always takes the shortest, straightest path from A to B. But when we look at the Bible,
Right.
It's just not the case at all. I mean, did God take the shortest, straightest path from the fall to redemption in Christ? No. He worked through all sorts of messy historical situations and people's sin and sex and violence and all the things. And Jesus, at the very center of God's plan for rescuing humankind, the plan was for him to die on a cross. So actually death and suffering are staked right at the heart of a Christian understanding of the entire universe. Now, I don't want to make it sound, and I think there are real questions that Christians, whatever the view they take of evolution, have to wrestle with. I think that's true across the spectrum, and I think we should be real and honest about that. So I'm not saying, oh, here's a nice, neat way in which these things fit together. But I do think that we can hold on to the complexity that we see in the scriptures under the reality of God's sovereignty and not against it, and not to assume a sort of imaginarily philosophical God of our own making who would always take the shortest, straightest route from A to B.
I guess what I would say is that I believe that if you roll the tape all the way back and you get to the beginning of creation, that matter is not self-creating. There has to be an intelligent being that created matter. And I refer to that intelligent being as God. And so that means what I see in the grand scheme of the narrative as it is depicted in the New Testament, or in the Old and New Testament, it depicts God as creator. And the world is self-reflecting God's own glory. And so when I look into the world, both in its kind of magnificence in like the grand sweep, where I'm just looking at the stars and the skies and the sunsets, I go, God is amazing. When I look at the particularities of the human person and the human body. And so I see, rather than like this idea that this all emerged through a series of unlikely coincidences, I see all of these things as manifestation of God's glory. And that to me is not in conflict with my practice of the Christian faith.
If you have a robust theology of creation, then this is God's world, and God has made it the way He's made it, and He's given us responsibilities in it. Those are the key things. And what I really worry about then is that when people look at, say, Darwin or Darwinism, and they say, oh dear, that's so wicked because evolution means that God is out of the picture, and whereas we believe in miracles, etc. I want to say, actually, so much of the Western world, including devoutly Christian America, has thrived on the belief of the survival of the fittest, that we are the strong guys in the world. We, the Enlightenment people, we know how the world works. We have our technology. We can go and drop bombs on you if you disagree. That's actually Darwinian politics, and it's embraced by some of those who reject Darwinian biology. And I think that's the sort of place where we ought to be pushing back and saying, let's have a very different debate and see how it works out. The miracles in the Bible are always about the restoration of creation and about the renewal of creation. They're not random crazy things just to prove how clever God is. And so it's one of the big struggles of our time, because a lot of devout Christians believe, and I understand why, that they have to be supernaturalists in this 18th century sense, because they see the only alternative being atheists or skeptics or naturalists. And I have fought against that in historiography, in theology, in Christology, etc. And I hope I'll go on fighting that battle to my dying day.
Well, let me give you two ways in which Christianity really is significant in helping to give birth to natural sciences. First of all, it talks about a creation that has been ordered by God, that God's wisdom and rationality is there in the ordering of the created world. And so in effect, immediately you have this idea that here is an ordered structure you can investigate, you can understand how its different aspects hold together. But there's a second point, and it's this. When I look at something very beautiful be created by a friend who's a sculptor or a painter, I will say, looking at what they've created helps me appreciate them. I understand their wisdom, their intelligence, their artistic creativity. For a Christian, science is in effect a way of deepening our appreciation of the richness, the complexity of the natural order, and hence deepening our appreciation of the God who made them.
One of your more recent books has to do with Albert Einstein, of course, one of the greatest scientists in history. What did you discover about not just his science, but his perspective of God?
What I discovered about Einstein was that he had a rather impersonal notion of God. I mean, Einstein famously said, "I don't believe in a personal God." And of course, atheist apologists have said that means he doesn't believe in God at all. He doesn't really. What he's saying is there is clearly a mind that lies behind our universe that we can never know fully. But questing for that mind is so deep and so rich. As a Christian, I say, I agree with you, but you don't go far enough. There's more that needs to be said. And so in many ways, what I'm saying is Einstein begins a wonderful conversation, but we can take it further, and that conversation needs to happen. I think one of the things I've discovered is that science is very good at helping us to understand how this universe, or indeed how we function. But you know, we need more than just an understanding of how we function. We want to know what we mean. And that's why science is great at helping us to understand how things work, but we want to know also what they mean. And science and faith thus come together to help us understand how things work, but also what they and indeed what we mean. We need to understand both functionality and meaning. Both on their own, not good enough. Put them together, you've got a full view of life.
We can have a full view of life. And in order to see it, we need to ask and answer very different questions. Science and faith don't start from the same premise, and they don't attempt to ask and answer the same questions. And so they give us a chance for us to be able to see and experience a grand view of what life has to offer us, and the beauty and the intricacy of what we can discover in God's glorious creation. Francis Bacon once said, "A little bit of science will take a man away from God. A lot of science will bring him back." This was true in my journey of faith, that the more I learned about this world that we live in, the more it brought me to my knees. And so if there's anything that feels like that it's in conflict, going all the way back to the 4th century with St. Augustine, he said, if we look at Scripture and we look at the world, and they don't seem to match up with one another, it's not the world that's wrong. It's not Scripture that's wrong. It's our interpretation of one of those things that is an error. Science and faith go hand in hand because there's only one universe. There's only one great center of that universe. All truth is God's truth. And there isn't anything that you're going to learn that isn't of God if it's true. And so march into these questions with the assurance and the confidence that science and faith are not at odds.